Hello and welcome to the EchoChamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves and today we're talking Moneyball for politics is what I've decided, Martin. It's going to be like everything for me comes back to sports. I'm a real loser like that, you know?
Yeah, well, you said it, not me.
As always, I'm joined by my co-host and the only man who thinks that a Malibu and Coke was part of his 5 a day.
It is. Trust me, it is.
Lads, you've no idea. He just literally, Malibu and a straw, that's all he wants.
Lilt. I've decided Malibu and Lilt is quite a nice
Oh
drink.
God. My whole
It's
stomach just feels nauseous. But much more importantly, we're delighted to be joined in the Tortoise Shack with Sociologist at the Higher Education Authority, UL graduate. There's someone from Limerick here, Martin. Are you nervous?
Yeah, no, I feel good that we got one out on Blind Boy, that's all.
And author of the forthcoming book, Austerity, Media Portrayals in the Public Sector During the Financial Crisis, Dr. Aileen Marron. Aileen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
We're going to jump straight in because that's all we ever do. Your book title alone actually gives the game away. You've written extensively previously on that. Do you want to tell us what the genesis of it was?
I suppose so. The research itself probably started back in 2010. I was doing my master's and I was working a summer job and I was struck there was a radio playing in the background and I was just struck by the coverage of the public sector at the time, and I didn't really know much about it, or I didn't know why, but I think I was very much struck by this public sector, private sector divide that seemed to be happening in media portrayals of the crisis. And so I decided, to cut a long story short, I decided to do my master's dissertation on it. And basically the research grew from the master's and I decided to turn it into a PhD. So the research essentially looks at how I focused on the Irish Times and the Irish Independent, and the research focuses on how public sector workers were covered in both publications. And I focused on coverage of the McCarthy Report, the pension levy and the Croke Park Agreement.
On board Snick Nua.
And so then following on from that, then I did a series of interviews with media professionals from both newspapers and did a little bit of observation of their newsrooms. And so the book will be mainly about that, but hopefully I'll be able to expand it out a little bit more and look at kind of media coverage of the public sector in other countries.
And give the context of the wider, because like the austerity was the choice. I think the phrase they used was no matter what the malady, austerity was the chosen prescription.
Sure, yeah.
And what we had in Ireland, and I again come back to what your study shows, we the use of actually almost a divide and conquer mentality to say, well, we can pin this all at the public sector's door a mentality of that we're spending, we're living way beyond our means. And there was an Irish mentality that we did particularly. I think it was Enda Kenny who came back and coined the phrase, we all partied. And that, we spoke downstairs and I think I made the admission that I pretty much partied, yeah, but I think I'm in a minority one in this room.
Absolutely. Most people did not party. Most people worked very, very hard. Yeah. And productivity was up over that period as well. So people did work particularly hard.
Yeah, I think, I think it was, I think there's been a lot of research done that has shown that the Celtic Tiger didn't reach vast quantities of Irish society. It was it was confined to a certain few. And I suppose the in terms of the coverage of public sector workers and more broadly of austerity, there really was just a very dominant discourse that austerity was the only way that we could achieve economic recovery. Overwhelmingly so, at least in the coverage that I examined.
And in the coverage that you examined, or did you find it was very much a divide and conquer?
I think the overwhelming narrative was one that austerity was the only way forward, and then within that, then you very much had this public sector, private sector divide that was kind of perpetuated by the likes of IBEC, ISME, and then within that again, you had, I suppose, this rationale to back up this idea that public sector workers were inefficient, that they were overpaid, and that they had been sheltered from the worst effects, of the crisis, whereas the private sector were taking the big hits. They were being made unemployed. They had no pensions.
And that's a narrative that's continued. That narrative hasn't stopped. I mean, we see it regularly, particularly in social media from sort of centrist right. It's the centrist right view. You'll see it even further out with the libertarians, you know, cut back, like these people cut back. And a lot of it comes down to pensions too, and they're constantly on at the pensions.
Yeah, I mean, the famous language or phrase that was used was the Rolls Royce pension. That public sector workers have this Rolls Royce pension, when in reality, the majority of public sector workers do not. Certainly, anyway, since 2010, I think, since the conditions around pensions were altered, are certainly not.
And this is where I think it's the conversation has to also bring on, because what we've seen then was the rise of a two-tier public service, where you had doctors, nurses, Gardaí, all starting on not even like slightly inferior contracts, majorly reduced terms and conditions. And then, you know, I only saw it today, actually. Ken Fox had a piece where they did a survey and they asked the TDs in Leinster House, you know, kind of what would they like and what would they not like. You know, like a staff survey. It was an employee engagement survey, for want of a corporate speak. And the first thing they came up with was better salary to attract better top talent people. And I just thought, oh my God, because it was, if you remember during the crash, it wasn't the CPSU that were the union that represented the lower paid public servants. They were the ones that were taking all of the shit, you know, and that's the cold hard reality. And what we saw very definitely was, you know, the irony of having Ivan Yates say civil servants were pulling us down, and him drawing a ministerial pension while going bankrupt, wasn't lost on everybody, but it was certainly lost quite often in the column pages and the columnists and the op-eds and the...
Well, I think there was another divide in there. There was a tyranny of age in that continues, in that people 40 and below, and even some above 40 now, are locked out of everything that the older people aren't locked out of. And that followed through with unions, that followed through with employers, that followed through with the state, where they cut social welfare for people under 26. There was a juvenile
deficit.
No, they were making babies of everybody under 26 years of age, making children out of them. And they're adults at 18. And then to make them babies going forward to 26, so their lives are delayed by a good 10 years.
The austerity, and that big word though, and then they tell us then we have no recovery. Does your research back up that it was the austerity that dug us out of the hole? Or?
So my research didn't really look at it, focused primarily just on media coverage of it at the time. So I didn't really look at whether austerity leads to economic recovery, although there's, I think, a lot of economists out there who would argue that it doesn't. I suppose the thing that was interesting to me and from my perspective in the research is those viewpoints did not feature in the coverage. So what you had was this overwhelming source bias. So a dependency on institutional viewpoints, on elite viewpoints, so government sources, as I mentioned earlier, the likes of business and lobby groups like IBEC and ISME. And completely absent from the coverage, interestingly enough, was the complete lack of a voice for the public sector worker. So you never heard from a public sector worker like a nurse. You never heard from a doctor talking about it from their point of view. And so consistently the voices all the time tended to be male. Politicians, government voices, and again, it was just consistently giving the same message all the time, which was, this is the only way forward. And then interestingly, when you looked at the structure of the articles, where there were, say, tokenistic mentions from the likes of Paul Murphy or people who were of left of centre, they tended to feature at the latter stage of the article. They never really framed the piece. And often in some cases were completely undermined by, follow sentences written by
And it still carries on to today. It still very much definitely carries on today. We've seen recent examples. I know I talked about the amnesia of of the Irish Times today, where Dublin City Council's chief in housing said we can't build a house for less than 330,000, and late last week the same newspaper ran an article on homes being built up the road in Ballymun for 165,000. I mean, what sort of editorial control is that, where we can't see the huge contradiction in that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I spoke to a number of journalists, and part of the study was to look at news, not just as news in terms of it being produced, it's influenced by the organisation in and of itself. In the same way that if any of you or I work in an organisation, there's certain rules that apply. There are certain people who have more discretionary power than others, and so media professionals operate within this environment. They operate within a structure, and they also have a certain amount of agency to make changes. And so one of the things, I suppose, that I used to talk to them about was how they understood the ideological orientation of their publication. And so both, media professionals from the Independent and the Times would have argued that they were economically, I think what one termed it as fiscally responsible, but then socially they would have seen themselves as liberals. So they would argue that they were, they would write about homelessness in one corner of the paper, but then in another they'd be arguing for austerity. And that contradiction doesn't seem to...
Are journalists aware of the bias that they carry with them?
It's not so much, I suppose, the approach that to the study I took, it's not so much focusing on bias. Bias is kind of an individual thing. You can be individually biased against anything, but they operate within I suppose they have this mentality that they are impartial and that they are objective and that they just report the facts.
Sorry to cut in, but there was an awful, Pat Leahy had this comment where he said, "Oh well, when both sides are giving out about me, I'm okay." And I just thought, no, Pat, you're clear. That's not actually playing it down the middle. If one side is, say, blatantly lying in a particular thing, we can't have the Trumpian both sides, good people on both sides crap. You can't have that, and you can't have them both being unhappy with you just because there's an onus on to report the truth, not to then say, well, that I just favoured one side over the other. I didn't want to favour one side over the other, so I didn't actually tell the full truth. I gave them a kernel there.
I think it goes back to their belief that in independence and impartiality. So they will always, if they are reporting from, you could see it with the abortion referendum, they'll report on one side and then they will report the other, even if the other is talking complete rubbish and the other sources. And it all goes back to this idea of it's a way, I suppose it's a defensive strategy. It's a way of them not being shown to show their personal opinions.
But it's very exploited.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And what ends up happening is you can perpetuate these kind of discourses.
But you don't need okay. So it's the same mentality where now this is the first summer we kind of see where people actually I realize climate change is a thing. But we're laughing about it, but we've known for decades that and now people are kind of saying, oh, it is a thing. But every time you had this, they would have always got a skeptic in to finish the article with the whole, and then I actually saw on the most recent one where the government's own watchdog, I think 2 weeks ago, came out and excoriated our government for their pathetic attempts to tackle climate change. And Minister Nocton, who was the Minister for Climate Action, actually used the phrase, well, that's the problem with environmentalists. And I just thought, how are you the Minister for Climate Action? And you said, there's no one. But where was the journalist that said, sorry, Minister, can I ask, why are you in that brief if that's your view?
It is all very Trumpian. It is, I think he has honed.
He's created it. Term for it, right?
Yes,
like people are talking about fake news as if it's this.
Yeah, it's like a new thing. No,
and it's not new at all. Really, it's just.
Well, when you look at the work you have done and the investigation you have done, and then we have a call to in some way publicly fund private media, and you must be going. Well, first you have to get it right before you publicly fund it. You can't publicly fund a one-sided narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you can make the case that, well, you have certain publicly funded organisations, but we have really, we are probably very well served in terms of our choice of publications, but in terms of the level of concentration for such a small island in media ownership,
Very high.
It's very high,
Yeah.
and that's something that's quite problematic, I think.
And now, yeah, and of course, and then when you say that, we know we spoke to Dil Wickersham about her experiences in News Talk, and this is not to pick on News Talk particularly, but this is to go to her specific case. And she said her phrase was that she realized she was censoring,
Yeah.
because she didn't want to. There was an editorial control that she was almost imposing on herself that she wasn't even conscious with until she stepped outside of the bubble. And when you have a large media group like that, and you have a vulnerable, precarious level of work, like
Lots of freelancers trying to get articles printed. You know the tone you need to write in to get your article printed.
Well, this was it, and that was a strong feature of the interviews, or a strong theme in the interviews with the media professionals that I spoke to, was this idea of self-censorship. It's I think some people have this perception that it's a media owner comes in and goes, "Oh,
Yeah.
don't write that story about me," but it operates in a very unspoken kind of way. And then you made the point that journalism is becoming increasingly precarious, increasingly casualized. A lot of the journalists that I would have spoken to, they're not just writing their article anymore, they're writing the headlines, they're sub-editing their own work.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and they're also on, very temporary contracts. And that, again, that kind of stuff played into coverage of the public sector. This awareness of what their editor wanted was a really strong reason, I think, as to why the Independent at the time focused so strongly on being against public sector and anti-trade union. They were very much aware of it.
And then we saw when he did that within the INM itself, and then we see what the difference that made to actual previous INM workers and their pensions being destroyed. Mm-hmm. So it really is Martin Turkey's voting for Christmas sometimes.
Look, I hate to be one to laugh at other people's misery, but it was coming a mile off. It was coming a mile off. INM was always going to shed people. And they did go out and vote really to cut their own throats. It was crazy stuff.
The interesting thing is, so much of the focus is on public sector pensions, when the question really should be, private sector workers should be outraged about that. They could work for 40 years and their pension could be gone just in the blink of an eye. And I suppose the argument that I think, or the focus should be on the fact that as long as public sector workers have pensions, it's something that can inspired to in the private sector, it's something to take a shot at as well. It's easier to. We always make this point. It's always easier to blame the other as opposed to actually look at it. I remember having a conversation about the burning of bondholders, and we said how we couldn't do it, and how we knew that Irish bonds had changed hands at a level beyond any other country in the world post crash, because basically other people wanted to sell our bonds because they thought we were going to default on them. So there was a fire sale in Irish bonds, and people said, well, and then the guys who bought them for 20, 30, 40 cent in the euro, they got all their money back, even though they'd only bought them for 30.
That's right.
And I remember making the argument, why don't we just go and find out what they've paid for these and offer them 60 cent on their thing and give them the return? And someone said, you can't do that. And on full disclosure, I had an investment vehicle myself in one of the major banks in the UK, and that was reduced to subordinated debt bond. And once it was reduced to basically junk bond status, after a couple of years, I received the check, and needless to say, a large amount of money, I think at the end, was valued at £2.84 less the price of producing the check. So you can do that, folks. It was done to me, and I just had to take my medicine and move on. But I just find it very funny where you said those stories were never told. That alternative was never put forward, because what was put forward is we're going to honour our debts. We're going to be the best boys in the schoolyard, or whatever it was, and Enda's going to get his chin tickled by Sarkozy.
Did you find the narrative attacked the left?
Yes, very much. Or it didn't necessarily attack it, but it just delegitimized it. And you could see it in the structure of the articles, and you could see it in the selection of sources. and particularly in the interviews. I suppose the thing that surprised me, I didn't maybe expect in the interviews it to be the anti kind of left, this caricature of the lefty loon, to be so forthright that there was really this kind of, there was an organisational culture, I think, that was pro-austerity, but that also extended, I think, to the individual, a shared maybe ideology.
So a cultural belief.
Yeah, belief that in realpolitik we had to accept it, and that was the only way forward.
The big boys knew what had to happen, and these left, and as you said, the lefty loony tag.
And
oh
it was
my God.
always kind of it's always interesting when you see coverage of the trade unions, and it's always there's chaos and there's warnings and there's threats and there's this, that, and the other, and then you see that kind of the other side of it is this reasonable, normal.
Well, we saw quite a lot with the Lewis coverage on that. That got really hysterical. Anybody can drive a Lewis. Okay, well, most people can tot up as well, so there's accountancy. Let's not make disparaging remarks. It's not the job, it's the cost of living in the city you're working in.
And like taking the jobs out of it, to go back to the language, because the language is very important. We had Brendan Ogle sit here, and Brendan Ogle was always introduced by everybody as the firebrand Brendan Ogle. And that was just how he was introduced on every media outlet. You wouldn't no person on the right would ever be. They would be actually they'd be introduced by their title or given, it would have been contextualized. And it was always very important for them to denigrate from the outset,
if you get, it's almost to be called a lefty now is to be branded something.
Leftist, I think, is the current slur.
Well, populist became a great one, but like, everybody negates that populism was born out of people who actually were dispossessed in the 1900s America, and that's where the populist movement came from. There was nothing wrong with wanting a bit more equality, guys. Do
you see any solutions, or do you see any remedies
in terms of media coverage? I think one of the biggest barriers is this professional value of objectivity, because it steers so much of how the journalistic profession, I think, deals with stories. If you think of the whole notion of objectivity, it's this idea that there is one particular truth, there's one particular way of reporting this issue. It doesn't allow for uncertainties, and I think that value filters into editorial decisions around content, the use of sources, and why we end up seeing these. You have one source talking about abortion, and then you have one side coming out
given another
exactly or with climate change. It's why you end up having these undermining viewpoints. And I think if you could move away from that style of journalism to one where it's maybe more reflective and more critical, I think that would, at least people who would, our audiences, media audiences would.
But breaking through is very difficult, because you only have to think, going back to the climate story. We've had, we saw, I think it was earlier this week, the government said that they're going to increase the carbon tax to do something about our, so it'll add to every householder's bills for turning on your lights and running your heating. And I think I made the point that 42% of our energy consumption is transport led. 20% of it is of our carbon emissions by industry and corporations, and 30% of it is by agriculture. Yeah. So what we're going to aim at, and none of those areas, folks, pay a carbon tax. It's just going to be the householder that's going to have to carry the burden. And then in the same breath, the government, I think they announced that the ESB came out and said, we're worried because we're opening so many data centers that they require more electricity. And you're literally in the same breath, it's, and you're just going, that is bad journalism. Mm-hmm. That is very bad journalism. You should be able to point from one thing and say that there is actually destroying what any potential good that we're going to do, and we're not showing any forward planning. And
well, essentially, you're paying a carbon tax so that they can have data banks somewhere and not pay a carbon tax, and that's how this works. It's how it all works.
yeah, but that's my point. Is if I'm sitting here, Martin, with you on a bloody podcast in a little house in Glasnevin, surely if I can see that someone at
No, but you see, you have, as you've explained to us, you have a narrative that says otherwise. And those who depend on that narrative to become informed depend on newspapers. And a lot of people still do buy newspapers. I know the circulation is way down, but they still sell a lot of newspapers in this country. Mm-hmm. And if that's the narrative in your hand, that's the narrative when you're sitting at the table having a little read of the paper, you absorb it, whether you believe it or not doesn't matter. Over time, you absorb enough of it, and then you become conditioned to think that way. And that's just how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I think circulation is definitely down, but I think, the Irish Times is our newspaper of record. I think The Independent is the largest selling daily. They're just two. I think traditional media outlets still have a perceived legitimacy. That I was reading only last week a piece on the Edelman Barometer. They produce a survey around trust. And interestingly, since this whole debate around fake news, you can see that trust in traditional journalism is rising again, and trust in social media is typically low. So, these arguments in social media are going to change.
But that is a narrative that's out there, and I was finding it very funny recently.
It's another war, yeah.
In that, it's only recently the paper of record had to pay out for an article that they printed, an awful article that they printed. So fake news comes in many shapes and forms, and historically, both the Indo and the Times have been caught out plenty of times on the stuff they've written. Plenty of times.
We don't. I think, what's the guy on Twitter? Portrayals, is it? At Be Your Own Reason, I think is the account, folks. He did an analysis of the last election, and he was able to show how basically, in terms of the political party coverage across INM, that whenever the word Sinn Féin was used, generally I think it was in 80% of the times within 45 words the words IRA were thrown in there as well. This kind of negative messaging is very important in certain aspects, and it breaks through. It makes a difference.
How are you going to handle this? You now have a book to write. Okay. You have to,
Thanks, Martin.
You have to keep a roof over your head while you write the book. You're very busy, and you are extremely busy, and you're doing a lot of things. This is not the only iron in the fire you have, so how are you going to manage this?
Oh, who knows? I don't quite think that far ahead.
One day at a time.
Yeah, I think so. I have a year to get the book written, but I'll be busy with work. I travel quite a bit with work, so it'll be written on airplanes and
the actual day job, the framing of data, as you put it in your own words, that's something that really interests me, because you have to be able to almost look at the data and come up with a narrative. Mm-hmm. We talked about austerity at the outset. That's what really was lacking when we look at this backwards now. We can I can read a central bank report and I can see how many mortgages are in arrears, what's 90 days down, what's three years down, and other people will interpret it differently. I have Brendan Burgess saying they're all just scroungers, and I might counter that with my opinion. But that doesn't mean that there's not 47 people maybe who have taken their own lives in that cohort of 18,000 households or something. Do you feel that in that, are you going to, can you tell that story retrospectively now, or is that something that you're just going to have to, we're all going to have to understand that, as a country, we're nearly going to have a collective, that never happened, that last decade, we'll just pretend that the actual things, yeah.
I think in terms of the book, it would be primarily a presentation of how the issue was covered, and then I think maybe another side of it, and I think the interesting side of it is always to look at the coverage that was left out, so the other side of the story that we didn't hear about, and I think then that really strengthens, and I think you really show where the discrepancy was and where the dominance of that discourse at the time. So I think from that point of view, I'll be able to do it to a certain extent.
Mm.
But
No, I'm not asking you to write a sob story. I'm just simply saying that when you see what's actually missing, because you will see a central bank report, it's very easy to read numbers on a page, but that's actually that's human suffering, and that's the cold hard reality of this. I always get very upset about the tracker mortgage scandal, and Martin always nearly has to put his hand on me to calm me down. But it's a well known fact that's never spoken about, that not one Irish bank has been fined for what is effect a systematic, I think they're calling it a scandal rather than a fraud, but it was systemic. It was across all the major banks, and we're not 1 cent has been fined. I mean, yet where are the op-eds on that on a Sunday, banging the table? Outside of maybe the occasional Jean Kerrigan article, that's about all we see.
I suppose that banking is a big advertiser. So
there you go.
Do you feel that is the overall advertising is that influence plays a lot into the narrative of?
I think it, in the same way that you have concentrated media ownership, which many journalists have spoken about it, and the idea of self-censorship. The Irish Times is interesting because it is a very different ownership structure. It's operated as a trust, right? So it doesn't have the same ownership issues maybe as Independent, the Irish Independent with Independent News and Media Group, but a huge. But and I suppose and talking to a lot of journalists, they would then make the case that media ownership is not really an issue for us. It's an issue for those journalists working in the Irish Independent, but we're a trust, so we're not impacted on by that. But their revenue is hugely dependent on advertising, and a substantial portion, particularly at the time of the crash, was heavily dependent on
property banks.
And so I find it hard to believe that that you're going to openly challenge the property market when a huge amount of your revenue is contingent on that sector.
Everybody knows how the links of the Irish Times to myhome.ie. I mean, it's in the public domain. We don't need to skirt around the issue. They are inextricably linked, and the property porn, priced out of Rialto. Try this. Did you see the €180,000 fixer-upper in Fingal with no roof on it?
I think that we're beginning to see that again and again and again.
Well, that's
the cycle perpetuating itself, which is kind of worrying. So.
That is terrifying.
Well, we could say that the under 25s aren't buying newspapers in the same numbers that they used to. So they're not they're targeting.
Well, they will be when they're sleeping on the streets and they're lying under them.
So at least they're targeting the people they targeted the last time, who got burned the last time. So maybe they'll have a little more sense. Yeah, maybe.
We live in hope.
But that is something, though. I think I'd like to just bring it to that. We saw that, as you said, this cycle of how things were reported. I don't know if we've learned any lessons either on a mainstream media basis or on an actual political and ideological basis, because we're just repeating some of the mistakes that we've already done. And I do know, when you start seeing things like headlines saying social media is a threat to our democracy was a headline I saw recently, and when they say social media is a threat to our democracy, I found the word "our" very, very interesting, because whose are you talking about? The cozy consensus, or
you gotta remember, just look at 4 weeks in the life of government. We have somebody coming out and going, "Oh yeah, everybody should have to supply their public services card number to Facebook to verify their identity." 4 weeks later, oh, we're going to have to fine Facebook for all the information they're mining on us, and you're just like, honest to God, if people just stuck up their hands and said, "I don't really know what's the best thing in this situation," the country would be far better off.
And there is, but that's not to negate the stuff that Facebook does, Martin. Social media can be an awful place.
Don't get me wrong. I don't know. Newspapers could be worse.
The comment section of the journal.
Oh, don't go there! You get me killed.
Well, thanks so much for coming on and having a
Thank you
chat
very
with
much
us.
for having me.
When you have your book done, will you come back and tell us what it's like and the dizzying heights of
Absolutely.
stardom?
Yeah.
Sign a book
There's-
for us
there's
and we'll give it away.
Who's getting the movie rights?
Yeah, that'd be a good one.
Yeah, we get Yanis Varoufakis to play
Terry.
himself.
Terry, look out for the movie rights. Terry, come on, Terry, do something. But it is and it's a very interesting story. It's the narrative of that period that was sold to people. This is the only way to do it.
Well, two things. This is the only way to do it, and the other thing is, rather than concern yourself with what's actually happening, blame the public sector.
Yeah, and it is it's a great story that needs to be told. So thank you for
Thank you very much.
researching it and all the work you've done on it.
Thanks very much for having me.
Cheers, guys. Thanks for listening. Hit subscribe. Tell your friends. Do leave us a review. Martin gets very excited when he gets a review. He has a double Malibu and Coke. Guys, talk to you all soon. Mind yourselves. Take care. Bye bye.